I was just saying that I made the initial error of not really checking what the purpose of the Engaged seminar series was about. And then yesterday I realised it was to do with methods. Well, I'm not really going to talk very much about methods. Because in philosophy, really our philosophical method is pretty much our philosophical content. So it's not often that we step back and reflect on what it is that we're doing when we're doing philosophy. And in fact, there are contested definitions of what it is to do philosophy, and we've got a couple of philosophers here as well who can pipe up. There's also distinctions between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, which are distinctions that were pretty much drawn from within self-defined analytic philosophers who wanted to distinguish themselves from what they called the mumbo-jumbo of Heidegger. So there was a sense that logic and language philosophy of Russell and Moore was analytic philosophy, Sartre, Heidegger, that sort of thing was continental philosophy, and there were, if not different methods, certainly different approaches. And it has subsequently been said that you can't define the philosophy in terms of continental and analytic, because of course analytic philosophers come from the continent, people like Victor Frager. So there's something else that's distinguishing them. And it could be said that analytic philosophers see what they're doing much more what the scientists do, that they're contributing to problems. Each of them is contributing to a problem, which they hope will move the debate forward. Whereas continental philosophers have big brushes and they paint with these elaborate strokes about the meaning of life and what it is to be in the world, without really paying that much attention to the detail of the problem. I think it's probably about time that we reassembled philosophy across different fault lines. So we reassemble it in terms of what we're interested in. And what interests me now is the phenomenon, the psychology, the phenomenology of living with dying, which means reassembling our philosophy in terms of addressing that problem. So it doesn't matter whether it's analytic philosophy or continental or ancient philosophy, it has something to contribute to that as a way of understanding it. That's what interests me. That said, of course I started from certain intuitions. An intuition is just something that puzzles you, provokes a question, provokes a problem. And the intuition was that if you have a poor prognosis, if you have the prognosis of a life-limiting illness, it really comes as a surprise. No matter what you think, no matter how much you know the fact is that you're going to die, when it's up front and close, it's very personal and quite different. So that interested me that it was a surprise. And the surprise indicated the uniqueness of my death. So this notion of a surprise, that it's surprising that we die, no matter the fact that we know that we do, that it reveals something about the uniqueness, that it's really my death, not yours, nobody else's, seemed to me to lead often to what you might call an existential crisis. Now, it sounds horribly adolescent, and all 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds go through this. What's the meaning of life? And in a sense, what I will claim is that the questions that arise at a certain point of poor prognosis are the same questions and problems we live with all the time, but we don't confront in a personal way. And when we do confront them, and it's up close and personal, actually we don't have the tools to deal with it. And people who have a poor prognosis of life-limiting illness report suffering depression and anxiety and a dislocation and an evacuation of meaning. And that's what I want to explore. So first, I start with some intuitions, which were these, that it comes as a real surprise, that somehow you think everybody else will die, but it just won't happen to you. There's a phenomenology attached, which is this sort of existential crisis, which I want to explore. As a philosopher, as we do, you start by clearing the ground, saying what you're not going to talk about, and you define the term. I'm going to look at two competing claims. One is that death gives meaning to life, and one is that life-limiting illness can evacuate meaning. That it's an existential crisis of meaning and purpose and what that is. And then I'm going to return to the notion of what we do as philosophers and touch on the idea that an ancient notion of philosophy is therapia, which is of living well, and whether you can live well right up to death. Because my intuition was that if you have a life-limiting illness, it tends to interfere with the living that you can do up to the point of dying. So a quote here from Epicurus, which is just reminding us what philosophy's therapy might look like. And hear the words of that philosopher who offers therapy for no human suffering. But just as there is no use in medical expertise if it doesn't give therapy for bodily diseases, so too there is no use in philosophy if it doesn't expel suffering of the soul. So the research question, I guess this is the methodology bit, is how can we live right up to death when you have a life-limiting illness? Okay, so, and then I'm going to map those thoughts onto a new AHRC research network we have, which is New Thinking About Living with Dying, and I'll talk a bit about the activities of that network. How long do I have? I won't take that, which is good because then I can open it up for discussion. There are a few things that we can say about death, and probably very few universals left that are uncontested and uncontestable, but this is true. It is transcultural and transhistorical, that you cannot avoid it. And that, of course, takes us to what we mean by the term death. And I think it does work as an irreversible breakdown of an organism. As a definition, it's sketchy, but it at least provides some underpinning. There is a cessation of awareness. There's an inability to continue functioning. It's the end of sentience, end of movement. All carbon-based life forms that are alive will die, and everything that has died was once alive. Now, we talk of the death of cars, of batteries of ideas. We talk of the death of democracy, of feminism, modernity, the death of the author. And for the sake of this paper, I'm going to accept the distinction between carbon-based, non-carbon-based life forms. That means that this group, democracy, feminism, modernity, the author, are only said to die in a metaphorical or figurative sense. What I do know is that when I talk about my death, I refer to the end of my projects, of activities, relationships and commitments. I know that my death curtails my projects and all that I once thought possible. I also know that because death signals the end of this cognitive subject, there will be no need to mourn the loss. And for this reason, Epicureans may be right to claim we should face death with indifference, because it means nothing to us. It's also true that the terms death and life are not exhaustive. It could be said not only that dying occupies an intermediate position between being dead and being alive, but also that, to some extent, everything alive is in the process of dying, and everything dying is still alive. And this porous quality between living and dying is on occasion evident in ways that we talk about suffering. So philosophers such as Kierkegaard will often talk about death in terms of, or suffering in terms of dying. Now there's a distinction to be made between death and demise, where one signifies a where one signifies legal, social, political matters, and one the existential moment of it. Now it's slightly a false distinction because of course you only die in a situation, so you can't really take that existential moment out. But for analytic interest, that's what I'm going to try to do. So I'm not going to talk about, this takes me on to the next list, things I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about the different meanings that death has across cultures. I'm not going to talk about the different status that being dead has legally across cultures and across history. I'm not going to talk about why organisms die and not organs, nor am I going to talk about, great deal of philosophy, you can just clear the ground by saying all these things are not quite relevant to what we're discussing. I'm not going to talk about the relationship between brain death and technical death. I know this occupies people and it's significantly important, but this just isn't what I'm interested in today. Nor am I going to talk about transhumanism, which is a fascinating new strain of argument. But transhumanists are about avoiding this very existential question. It's about putting yourself in a fridge until you can be revived again, because we can overcome the limits of mortality. Well, why do we want to overcome those limits? Why is it's transhuman? Because we're defined in terms of our death. To overcome the limits of our mortality is to go beyond being human. So that's the sort of transhuman enterprise. I'm not going to talk about that. Nor am I going to talk about the ontological status of the dead, that's supposed to read. So what status do the dead have? And those who are not yet alive, do they occupy the same ontological status? Nor am I going to talk about the afterlife, because those who believe in an afterlife, I think, are really merely passing through. Their notion of death is quite different from the type of cessation that I'm talking about. And so that's a different argument. Nor am I going to talk about the horrors that we inflict on people and how immune we can become to the death of others. I'm not going to talk about the banality of evil. What does that leave me? Really quite a lot, honestly. Like it's a sort of philosophy 101 syllogism. Plato is a man, all men are mortal. Plato is mortal, but the truth of this syllogism is something that the personal truth of it is something that we skit around and we don't. Many of us don't apprehend in anything more than a cognitive sense. However, there's a stream of philosophy, philosophies of finitude, where philosophers argue that the meaning of being human is the fact that we die, that we are mortal. And since Plato, it's commonplace to assume that the meaning of death illuminates the meaning of life. And for Plato, doing philosophy in the right way is not just about answering questions about dying, but is in itself getting used to facing death calmly, indeed practicing death, in which case there would be no fear. So philosophy as a practice would be about preparing us for something that's inevitable so we can face it without fear. Pierre Hadot reminds us that in most schools of ancient philosophy is essentially meditation on death and an attentive concentration on the present in order to live it in full consciousness. The thought there, which is quite common to Buddhist philosophies, I think, Chris will correct me, is the thought of impermanence, that by reminding ourselves of our mortality, we attend to the present in a much more refined and open way. For others, Neoplatonists mainly, because there is no pure knowledge in the company of the body, wisdom is only possible when we are dead. In different ways, Heidegger, Levinas, Derrida, that's your Continental bit, all agree that death gives meaning to life. Heidegger would have us believe that the uniqueness of our existence is revealed to us through the fact we must die, that we must die alone, and no one else can die for us. Death as my peculiar possibility wrenches me from the they, and with a newfound perspective on what matters, I can take a stand in authenticity. This is what he calls the non-relationality of death. In anticipating death, I take responsibility for myself, my own person, and my relations with others are severed. In moments of despair, we cannot conceal our underlying anxiety over the seeming meaninglessness, banality, and emptiness of devoting one's life to merely doing what is in one's culture. So for him, that we will die is enough to wake us up to what he calls this banality, the mediocrity, the they. It lifts us from it, so it, in a sense, it matters differently. It's freeing then. Anxiety in the face of death liberates us from possibilities that count for nothing and lets us free for those that do count for something. We are distinguished, he says, from other animals by the fact that we experience ourselves as mortal. This means, of course, we can't face death neutrally because it's our own inmost possibility. So we have a strand of philosophy then that claims that there is something very positive, very important about facing up to death, because it reminds us of our mortality and that we are individually responsible for our lives. Now, in response to Heidegger's non-relationality view of death, Caballero suggests that we need to think, now here's a bit of a conundrum, we need to rethink death along the lines of mentality, thinking death in terms of birth, which seems a conundrum. But what she wants to highlight is that dying is itself relational, that you are already in relations, and it's severing human relationships that matters. She then invites us to reconceive death as bodily dissolution and reintegration into cosmic life. This impersonal approach to death, one also attempted, I think, by new materialists such as Deleuze, is at odds with her own view that birth has ontological significance because it's the appearance of a unique being. So I don't see how she can really rethink death along the lines of mentality, and by thinking mentality and birth, she's thinking not only relationships, but also the appearance of a unique being. Whereas when she's talking about death, it's a dissolution of that unique being into cosmic life. Alison Stone also tries to think death in terms of relations. So the significance of somebody's death, to the extent they anticipate it, is that they mourn for relationships that they will lose. Yet the idea of my death happening to me as a web of relations, I think, is counterintuitive, because there is a radical asymmetry. I might mourn losing relationships with others, but actually I'm the one that's going to die. So you can't make it simply about a process of mourning and of loss, because it's my death, it's my life. And yes, I might mourn these relations, but nonetheless, there is something peculiar to me, so there's an asymmetry there. And so I don't think it's enough to draw on a psychoanalytic account that would mean your death is just a psychic death of part of me. but each death just moves into another. Right, so all of these are approaches to the notion that death gives meaning to life, that tries to, in a sense, give life to that syllogism. We have the notion that mortality, thinking about death and finitude, brings an attentiveness to the present, that it reveals a uniqueness, finitude, the personal nature of death. That the third point is that as we die, we construct our past so it conforms a coherent narrative, and that's the meaning that we attribute to life and to death. So as we die, we can look back and say, well, that was what I was doing, and so it gives it a narrative. And then finally we have the thought that death gives meaning to life because it calls attention to relationships, the relationships that we're embedded in and that we may or may not lose. Now, the counterclaim is that far from giving meaning to life, actually dying evacuates meaning from life. And this interests me. Now, the meaning of life, says Terry Eagleton, is a subject fit for either the crazed or the comic. The idea that anybody could stand up and talk about the meaning of life, even if they haven't seen what it's like, then has to just be absurd at some fundamental level. There is something absurd, he says, about its overarching pretensions. Indeed, you could ask the question, what is the meaning of life a meaningful question? Is there any answer that you could think of, that you could give, that would be satisfactory? It's not like saying, what's the capital of the UK? All of that said, and I recognise the absurdity of standing up here talking about the meaning of life and living and dying. Meaningfulness does seem to be related to purpose. A meaningful life is a life with purpose. If that's the case, then what do we mean by purpose? Right. Now, for the sake of simplicity, we can say, well, there are broadly these two senses and meanings to purpose. We can attribute meaning to purpose to persons and behaviour. Take the first one. If you ask, what is the purpose of a gadget, you're asking really about its function. What role does it play? What does it do? What's its function? Or you could attribute it to persons and behaviour. You say something like, what is the purpose of putting the light on? Again, for the sake of simplicity, you could say the first sense maps onto the notion of the pre-modern. So you have a sense of a divine plan, telos, soul. Life is meaningful to the extent that it fits in with a broader purpose, a broader plan. Your purpose is to fit in with that broader plan. And the second definition maps onto what you might call the modern. So, with the I dislike talking about the Enlightenment as though it were a thing that occurred in a certain place at a certain time, but give me that. The Enlightenment, or for the modern, you might say that meaning is related to our projects. What you throw into the world is meaningful. So what you decide to do, how you decide to live, gives meaning to your life. And that's related to intentions, values, and objectives. So for the modern, for the enlightened person, this pre-modern way of looking at things is misconceived. Because to say your purpose is that you fit in with another plan is, for example, saying that chicken has a purpose because it'll end up as coq au vin. So for the moderns, the pre-moderns we're actually looking at people as though they were mere functions or instruments in a broader picture. And we're all very enlightened now, so we're all in these since the death of God. We're all thoroughly enlightened, so we're all quite familiar with the notion that meaning relates to purpose, which relates to our projects and intentions. The question is whether scientific enlightenment leads to a disenchantment of the world, or does it provide us with the tools to realise our projects? Right, so for the post-Kantians, you could argue that without the divine plan, without a telos, we're all just abandoned, thrown into the world of individual projects where meaning and purpose comes back to you. For the critical theorists amongst us, there is an uneasy relationship, but necessary nonetheless, between this and the disenchantment of the world. That our ethics, our moral judgments seem to be themselves without foundation. Right, so in the quotidian, in the everyday, in the pragmatic, what Thomas Nagel describes as the creaturely, meaning and purpose relate to our projects. A project is a series of events and actions made meaningful by an underlying purpose. So objects in the world have meaning not just because language is a public matter, but because objects contribute something to our activity. An example deployed by Sartre is that of the mountain. Is it to be climbed or painted? If my intention is to climb it, I perceive its height, the character of its landscape, distance to the summit, or quite differently from the case where I intend to paint cloud movement across its peak through watercolour. Of course the mountain is there, in Sartre's words, the craggy mountainside, as a measurable coefficient of adversity. But what it means, how much it matters, relates to my project to paint or climb it. Even my relationships with people gain their textures through my projects. So the conversation I may have with somebody at a school gate matters due to the fact we have a mutual interest, say, in how events might develop with the rugby coach or the football coach, whether we'll complain about a certain teacher or not. An easygoing banter with a friend matters because of a shared past, negotiated present, and an orientation to the future. My activity at work means what it does, with reference, sadly, to the institution's strategic plan for future development and investment. I am not Prime Minister, I am not a Nobel Prize winner, in the sense of not yet being Prime Minister, not yet being Nobel Prize winner. But just as the repetitive toil of Sisyphus, just as the repetitive toil of Sisyphus indicates the endless pointlessness and meaningless of activity, we can ask of our projects, is each one only and merely a repetition of the last? For Thomas Nagel, herein we can see the collision of our two viewpoints that we discussed earlier. The meaningfulness of our everyday purposive activity, a meaninglessness when viewed through a broader lens. If meaningfulness resides in what matters, in what interests me, then we are provoked into infinite regress. The infinite regress of justification. Why does X matter because Y matters? Why does Y matter? And so on. The problem, and here we can hear the echo of the cosmological argument, reasons within life are incomplete. All internal reasons are incomplete. But absurdity is the situation which includes a discrepancy between what we aspire to and reality. We aspire to purposefulness, yet the reasons we can give for each activity are only ever incomplete. Absurdity, says Nagel, is a collision with ourselves. So in these very modern times, meaningfulness of our everyday activity is just based on our projects, on our plans. It takes account of the past, it's a negotiation of the present and the relationship to the future and the horizon of activity. Yet we step back from that and we say, does it really matter about the strategic plan? You don't have to step back very far before you can answer that. But then you step back a bit further. Why do I go to work? Does it really matter that I pay the bills on this and that? And the what matters question, it just becomes more and more difficult to answer until, enable, we reach the recognition that our everydayness cannot have the purposefulness that we ourselves aspire to. If our absurdity may occasionally disturb us, causing moments of existential anxiety, what else is midlife crisis? Then how much more pressing, more critical, when the meaningfulness of everyday activity is interrupted? When a patient receives a poor prognosis, then the future itself is disturbed, and the problem of meaningfulness and time emerges. When projects are truncated, the present, the fault of the past and the future, seems exhausted and evacuated of meaning. My thought here isn't just that, it's really frightening to think about dying. Yes, of course it is. But actually, a life-limiting illness does something else as well. What it does is take your future away. And by taking your future away, it makes it very difficult to live the present. Because our present is a negotiation of the present towards the future. If you don't have that future, how do you live the present? As thoroughly modern beings in an enlightened world where there is no divine plan. This temporal fracture incites the question, was that it? Peter Greenaway's Belly of the Architect rumbling on, ravenous yet empty. At the very moment when a patient experiences the greatest turbulence, the problem of everyday meaningfulness can arise and seem too toxic to bear. Those who still envisage the future as their own do not experience this temporal fracture or the existential exhaustion that follows. This death is my death, and the life in question is mine. It has an irrefutable first-person quality, and here, I think, is the argument against postmodernism. It has an irrefutable first-person quality. In any situation, these feelings may compel us to change direction, to alter our conditions, but in this state, the only appropriate response seems to be hopelessness. Without a future, with only a degraded past, the present is a very poor place indeed. It has been said that to describe a personal situation that is without hope is to slam the door in the face of God. But what then does it mean to be engulfed by hopelessness, to be without hope? So what I'm saying is that Heidegger was right up to a point. Humans are the only animals, it is extraordinary, humans are the only animals that confront their own situation as a question, a quandary, a source of anxiety, a ground of hope, a burden, a gift, one that is absurd. And until the visceral truth of aloneness and ownership of death is grasped, the rest, I contend, does remain merely abstract, a banal question too easily put. But, against Heidegger, I suggest that dying doesn't enable authentic existence, rather it clogs the mind with terror and evacuates meaning from the world, from my world. Fear, anguish, depression, and a retrospective was that it, can ruin the life as it is lived up until death. The belly of an architect shudders in involuntary spasms. For some it may be the case that they experience a sense of unity in their practical identity, this narrative arc that as I'm dying I go, oh, it all makes sense now, this is what I was about. But for most, death is just that makes the narrative fragment into endless modal alternatives. What if I'd done that when I was 16? What if I'd stayed with them? What if I'd left them and gone over there? What if I'd moved to India? Endless modal alternatives of how things could have been different. There is lots of people started thinking about hope, hopefulness, and hopelessness, and there's an interesting correlation between work that is occurring at the moment in psychology in dealing with parents of children with cancer and the medics around terminology of hope, because people are looking for hope. Well, what does it mean to be hopeful? There is a notion of hope which, in both secular and non-secular versions, is the idea of open-ended hope. This is an idea of hope as a creative process, a sense of journey, becoming, or transformation. It is not a false hope. It is not the hope that somebody will discover a miracle drug. It is not the hope of life everlasting that the transhumanists have. And philosophical reflection can disabuse us of such false hopes. So philosophy can help to iron out the kinks in reasons for believing certain things might be the case. And philosophy can help demonstrate the unreasonableness of other beliefs. But hope resides in the transformation of relationships with other human beings and with a non-human world in such a way that we can focus on the interaction and their intrinsic worth. The practice of living well right up to death might require the cultivation of a specific habit of mind, that of hope. Open-ended hope is hope that doesn't hope for something. It is not object-related. It all looks a bit twee, and it is in a way, but there is a strand within existentialism, and it's also apparent in some phenomenology, such as Lucille Gray, if she prepared to be called a phenomenologist, that cultivating nature enables a certain attention not only to non-human objects, the non-human world, but also to ourselves. But this is also evidence-based, because parks were first designed due to the belief that they would bring about health advantages, and that there were healing effects of greenery in stressful environments such as hospitals and nursing homes. Studies show that in hospital, those with a view recover faster, require fewer painkillers, and suffer fewer post-operative complications. Employees with a view of nature report fewer illnesses, headaches, and stress. Experiences of green spaces maybe allows our two senses, our two perspectives to coexist. Often gardens are distinguished from artworks or nature more generally. However, I wonder whether this commingling in parks enables our two perspectives to coexist, and it is this that helps us to live with our own absurdity. So this is what Viktor Frankl is suggesting, where he's reporting the story of a friend who's dying. And his friend says, "This tree is the only friend I have in my loneliness. It," the tree said to me, "I am here, I'm life, eternal life." Now this sense of the eternal in the present is what Lucille Gray calls a sensible transcendental. That in our everyday experience, there can be moments of this, of the transcendental that I've initially identified as these two senses of purpose. So we have purpose of our everyday meaningful activity related to projects, purpose of the divine, the telos, project, divine plan, We've abandoned the divine plan, those of us who no longer believe in monotheistic God. We're left only with the everyday purpose. Yet maybe during life, at certain points, such as life-limiting illness, poor prognosis, you're forced into that moment of absurdity of thinking of your everyday in terms of the eternal. What can help us there? Not turning, unless you want to turn to a theistic paradigm, which many do and which does help. But another option is to cultivate nature, which itself is transformative and creative and hopeful, even if your future is truncated, even if you don't have very long to live. There is also the thought of cultivating communication. Kierkegaard might be right that some experiences just cannot be said. You cannot put in propositional form the experience of really confronting your own mortality. Well, how do we engage with it then? How do we talk to one another at those times? Kierkegaard has this sort of indirect communication, that the unsayable requires indirect speech, and I'll come back to that. So, sort of concluding, philosophy shouldn't be the practice of death, but that of life, of living well right up to death. The question is whether the experience of particular philosophical practices can induce a habit of mind or a certain way of living to which others might aspire, even if only for this moment. A habit of mind that allows us to live right up to death with hope. The strand of philosophy, which is Philosophia's Therapia, is articulated by pragmatist William James, who said that this meant realizing that theoretical reason, pure reason alone, cannot provide answers to the questions that are most troubling. Philosophy can do the conceptual and causal work, but the reconsideration of living up to death, I think, also means coming across the limits of philosophy. And the limits of philosophy end at the point we start talking about cultivating nature and cultivating communication, because these are different practices. Philosophy may be able to, as I say, point out where our hopefulness is hope for an object that can't be realised. What it can't do is this practice, which is about cultivating a state of mind of hopefulness, even in the face of a shortened future. So that takes me to the research network. I've got some handouts here, which are they just tell you what the different events are. It's a shameless form of publicity, really. And invitation, a standing invitation. We have 3 workshops. The research network is bringing together academics and practitioners interested in the psychology and phenomenology of living the dying, because of clinical advances, people are having to face this existential crisis that I'm talking about for years. You can have a poor prognosis and still be alive 4, 5, 6 years later, living moment to moment with this existential crisis, this level of absurdity pointed out by Thomas Nagel, and that's impossible. It's impossible to sustain it, and to sustain it well. So clinical practitioners are turning their attention to this extended life. There are structured pathways of care for people with terminal illness, but for people who are going to die in 5 years' time, clinical practitioners just try and keep them alive, and that's what they're concerned with. But for those who are being kept alive, it is an ongoing negotiation of this existential crisis where they have no future. and so their normal projects seemed meaningless. So we have 3 research workshops. Our network brings together clinical practitioners, including psychology here, Peter Salmon, who works on a cancer research group, and John Ellishaw, who is the director, that's what we call it, of the Marie Curie Palliative Care Unit, and theologians and philosophers and anybody else who's interested. And we have 3 research workshops identified. The first is thinking about dying, which is just thinking through some of these problems about time, future, meaningfulness, existential crisis, which takes us on to the second research workshop, which is mental health and living with dying, because it's a very anxious time, very stressful. But more than that, can there be anything more than that? People, and this does map onto concerns that people working with the elderly have. As your body changes, as you go through intense treatment, what your body can do and what it looks like also changes. And this sense of loss that people live with itself contributes to the feeling of the meaninglessness or worthlessness of the life as they're living it. So the challenge is to allow your body to change without feeling that as a loss, where you're always aiming back for a past that you can't recover. So changing identities, changing bodies, living with anxiety, that sort of thing is the concern of the second workshop. And the third research workshop is the clinical model of care, whether it does make sense to have a structured pathway of care for such a long time, and how clinicians might talk to patients who are undergoing that trauma, the unsayable. And then we have these 3 public events. The first is with the Disability and Deaf Arts Festival, because I believe that it's critical disability theorists who have the most to teach us about how to live a changing body without living that as a loss, but there are norms that you're continually trying to recover. So we're trying to bring disability theorists together, disability practitioners with patients with life-limiting illness. The second is reading as therapy. This is through the reader group, that sometimes the unsayable can be expressed but otherwise. My intuition is that reading won't do it, but music might. But we'll see. So we're running a workshop on this. And the third, this is with Nest Gardens, Sefton allotment groups, putting into practice the idea of cultivating nature without, for example, having to take responsibility for a garden at a point where you're tired and you're not very fit, but just the experience of tending, being attentive to, enables the patient themselves to care for themselves and to tend to themselves. But there's something transformative in that relationship. So they're the 3 public events and the 3 research workshops, all of which are mobilised by this one thought leader from Paul Ricoeur, who had posthumously published book Life Unto Death. The mobilisation of the deepest resources to affirm this life, my life unto death. The research question, as I say again, how can we live right up to death, even when that period, during life-limiting illness, when we know that we only have a few years to live. That's it. Thank you.